The alien officer stood in the middle of the war room, surrounded by a group of elite soldiers from multiple species. These creatures, each one genetically superior in some way, had been bred for war, specialized in tactics, destruction, and survival. They sat around a large holographic table, listening to the briefing that had become so routine for them. Battle strategies, combat zones, objectives, resources, everything was laid out in perfect order. They were prepared for the coming war. And yet, as the officer spoke, one thing gnawed at them: the human soldier. In the corner of the room, the lone human sat with their arms crossed, staring at the holograms without saying a word. While the rest of the room filled with chatter, laughter, and occasional argument over strategy, the human remained perfectly still, calm, unmoved. It was as if they didn't care. Not for the tactics, not for the looming war. The other species in the room joked about how easy this would be. Their technology was far superior to anything the enemy had, and their numbers were overwhelming. This would be a cakewalk. Yet, despite the confident banter, the officer couldn't ignore the humans' quiet presence. Something about it bothered them. There had been reports from the humans' previous battles. Most of them had been unremarkable. The human had been sent to support other species, mostly there for cannon fodder, part of the expendable infantry. They had followed orders. They had fired weapons. But nothing special stood out in the human service record. Why was this human so silent now, in the briefing room of all places? Why was there no eager chatter? No questions, no concerns? The officer tried to push the thought away. It was just a human, after all. These creatures had always been a curiosity, but their value was well understood. They were resourceful, if not particularly strong or clever compared to the other species in the galaxy. It was their capacity for endurance that made them useful. But in the officer's mind, this silence was something different. There was a tension in the air as the briefing continued, and the officer's eyes drifted back to human. The room was full of voices, discussing plans and potential pitfalls. The alien species were deep in the flow of strategy, but the human didn't speak, didn't react, didn't even blink. It wasn't the kind of quiet the officer had expected. Some soldiers were silent out of fear, unsure of what they'd gotten themselves into. Some stayed quiet because they had no opinion, no plan of their own to offer. But this human, this one was different. The officer could feel it. There was a strange energy coming from them, a calm, calculated presence, like a predator studying its prey. It was unnerving. The officer glanced over the table. The others were oblivious to growing unease. They continued their discussion, debating strategies, confident in their overwhelming technological advantage. What they didn't realize was that there was more at play here than just superior weaponry. The human soldier was not afraid. It wasn't that the human didn't care about the battle. It was that they had already seen something deeper, something none of these other soldiers could even begin to fathom. The silence wasn't a sign of weakness. No, it was a warning. The officer, still trying to focus, noted the relaxed, yet unwavering posture of the human. It almost seemed like they were waiting for something, a signal, an event, a moment. The officer began to wonder, not for the first time, if the human was more than just an expendable soldier in this war. At that moment, one of the alien officers, a massive creature with 6 arms and a voice that resonated like thunder, laughed. "The enemy thinks they can stand against us," the creature bellowed. "Our weapons are far superior. We'll wipe them out in days." The others chuckled, some agreeing with the sentiment, others offering more tactical suggestions. Everyone was filled with confidence, almost to the point of arrogance. But the human stayed silent, still and observant. The alien officer shifted uncomfortably. The silence from the human had become oppressive, somehow. It wasn't that they were out of place. It was more like they were simply waiting for something. A flicker of understanding crept into the officer's mind, though it was fleeting. Perhaps the human knew something they didn't. But if that were true, why didn't they speak? Why not share whatever insight they had? The room carried on, unaware of the shifting undercurrents. The officer moved to wrap up the briefing, but the thought of a human remained. For a fleeting moment, the officer was certain that there was something more to the human than what they appeared. But the moment passed, and they pushed the feeling aside. The final strategy was agreed upon, and the soldiers began to leave the briefing room. Yet, the officer couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't a tangible fear. There was no specific reason to feel worried. Everything was in order. The battle would be won. But the officer could feel that something was wrong. And for a brief instant, they found themselves wondering about the quiet human soldier, who, in their stillness, seemed to know more than anyone else in the room. The officer tried to ignore it. They had dealt with far more dangerous situations. And the human, after all, was just a human. But the feeling lingered. As the door to the briefing room closed, the officer couldn't help but glance back at the human once more. The warning, silent and subtle, hung in the air like a threat yet to be realized. The battle began without warning. As the alien forces descended onto the planet's surface, there was a palpable excitement in the air. The technology they carried, weaponry that could disintegrate entire cities, ships that could fly across galaxies in mere hours, was unmatched. They were confident, almost cocky, in their superiority. The enemy, they believed, would fall before them without a fight. The briefing had made it clear. Victory was inevitable. The human soldier moved with the rest of the troops, their face unreadable, their steps deliberate but slow. The aliens, each one bred for war, moved with purpose. They were used to leading armies, commanding vast fleets, and watching planets fall before their might. But the human, they were just another cog in the machine. Still, the officer could not shake the unsettling feeling that had lingered since the briefing. The human had been silent then, and they remained silent now. As they moved into position, there was no tension in their face, no fear. Unlike the others, who displayed a mix of nervous energy and adrenaline, the human was calm. The officer couldn't help but wonder that calmness was the first sign of something deeply unsettling. The first shots rang out. It was chaos. Explosions lit up the sky as the enemy's defensive lines opened fire, catching the alien forces off guard. The initial wave was supposed to be a sweep, a minor push to establish a foothold. But the enemy was prepared, their weapons far more devastating than anticipated. The aliens struggled to adjust. Their tech was advanced, but the enemy's tactics were unpredictable. The alien soldiers had grown used to fighting against species that followed predictable patterns. But the enemy didn't. They fought like shadows, disappearing into the terrain and striking with lethal precision. The alien forces were being overwhelmed. The human, however, remained unaffected. While the chaos swirled around them, they moved with eerie purpose. The officer noticed it again, the same unsettling calm. Where the others were panicking, looking for cover, yelling commands, the human soldiers' movements were measured, deliberate. There was no panic in their eyes, no rush. They observed the battlefield with the predator's focus. Waiting for an opening, a group of alien soldiers tried to regroup behind a shattered building, was quickly cut down by an enemy ambush. They had been caught in a trap. The officer looked on in shock. These were experienced soldiers, elite warriors, but they had been outmaneuvered. The enemy was far more advanced than they had been led to believe. They had underestimated the enemy's intelligence, their ability to adapt. The alien forces were being torn apart, and there was no immediate solution in sight. Yet, amidst the confusion, the human soldiers stood still. They weren't hiding, weren't running. Instead, they simply watched, their eyes narrowing as they took in the enemy's movements. The officer, frustrated and growing desperate, barked orders to regroup, but it was too late. The aliens were losing, and in the midst of the chaos, one thing became clear. The human was the only one who wasn't panicking. The officer finally caught sight of the human again. They were moving now, swiftly, silently. The officer's confusion deepened as the human darted through the shadows, moving against the flow of the battle. Unlike the others, who were either charging into the fray or retreating in panic, the humans seemed to be seeking something. They weren't just fighting. They were calculating, positioning themselves in places no one else seemed to consider. The alien officer wanted to scream at them, tell them to fall back, to regroup with the others. But the human ignored them. In the distance, the officer saw the human disappear into fog of war, weaving through enemy lines, seemingly unnoticed. Moments later, the situation worsened. The enemy had encircled the main command center, cutting off the alien forces' retreat. The officers' heart pounded as they realized the full scale of the disaster unfolding before them. Their forces were disintegrating. They were losing this battle, and fast. Just as the officer was about to give the order for a full retreat, a sudden explosion rocked the battlefield. Then another, and another. The enemy lines began to falter. The officer's eyes widened in disbelief as a human emerged from the shadows, a ghost among the chaos, their silhouette barely visible against the smoke. They had somehow disabled the enemy's communication system, crippling their coordination. The human had turned the tide. With quiet efficiency, they had infiltrated the enemy's ranks, sabotaged their systems, and caused the chaos to work in their favor. The aliens had underestimated the human skill. In fact, they had failed to recognize the true danger the human posed. Not in strength, but in intellect, cunning, and an almost predatory understanding of warfare. The officer watched in stunned silence as the human moved forward, their calm demeanor still unwavering. As the alien forces began to rally, the officer realized they had been wrong. Completely wrong. It wasn't the alien forces that were at the mercy of the enemy. It was the enemy that was at the mercy of a human. The human hadn't been afraid, and they hadn't been silent out of uncertainty. They had been watching, waiting, calculating. The officer realized that, for the first time, they were seeing the full potential of the human soldier, someone who fought with their mind, not just their weapons. By the time the battle was over, the alien forces had won, but the cost had been great. The enemy was retreating, scattered, and in disarray. But it wasn't just the alien forces that had won the battle. It was a human soldier whose quiet, unassuming nature had been the greatest weapon of all. And as the officer looked at the human once again, they couldn't help but feel a profound respect for the creature they had so wrongly underestimated. The aftermath of battle was a scene of both triumph and chaos. The alien forces had succeeded in pushing the enemy back, but the victory came at a steep price. The battlefield was littered with the debris of broken technology, scorched earth, and the bodies of fallen soldiers, both alien and enemy alike. The air was thick with smoke, and the sounds of distant explosions continued to echo through the landscape, a grim reminder that the war was far from over. The officer stood amidst the carnage, taking in the scope of the destruction. Their forces had been humbled, and it was clear that the enemy had been far more capable than they had anticipated. Still, victory was theirs. But the cost was steep. The once boisterous confidence that filled the war room seemed hollow now, replaced by a grim realization that things would never be as simple as they had thought. And yet, as the officer surveyed the scene, there was one thing that stood out above all else: the human soldier. The human had vanished in the midst of the chaos, slipping away from the fray with such quiet precision that no one had even noticed. The officer watched as the human moved through the enemy's lines, their calm demeanor never faltering, their actions never erratic. The victory had been earned, in part, by the human's subtle intervention. Yet the human's absence now was as unsettling as their presence had been earlier. The officer's thoughts swirled with confusion. Why had the human not sought recognition? Why had they remained silent throughout the battle, only intervening when it mattered most, and then disappearing just as quickly? They had effectively altered the outcome of the conflict, yet no one knew how, nor did anyone truly understand why. In the days that followed, the officer tried to piece together the events of the battle. There were reports, of course, communications sent in the heat of battle, messages relayed from the front lines, but none of them mentioned the human's role in the success. The alien forces had rallied, yes, but the true turning point had come when the enemy's communications had been severed, when their coordination had broken down. The human had been the one to accomplish that, but no one had seen it happen. No one had understood what had occurred until it was too late. The officer began to question the intelligence of their fellow commanders. They had assumed that the human would be an insignificant part of the battle, someone to follow orders, to stand by, to contribute in small, predictable ways. Instead, the human had shown them a different kind of warfare, one that didn't rely on overwhelming firepower or brute strength, but on strategy, on foresight, on understanding the battlefield in ways no one else had. The officer's mind raced back to the moment in the briefing room, when they had first noticed the human silence. At the time, it seemed like nothing, Just another soldier, indifferent to the discussion, uninterested in the tactics being laid out. But in hindsight, the officer now saw it for what it truly was, a warning, a sign of something deeper. The human had known. They had understood. They had been preparing for this battle in a way no one else had. It was then that the officer realized that the human had been the true strategist of the conflict, not in the traditional sense, but in the most profound way imaginable. They had observed, they had waited, and when the time came, they had acted with precision. They hadn't shouted orders. They hadn't made a grand display. They had simply made the right moves at the right moments. The officer's admiration for the human began to grow, but so did their unease. What kind of soldier was this? How had they managed to remain so composed, so deliberate throughout the entire engagement? It was as though the human had seen something that no one else had, something that made them operate on a different level. The officer began to wonder if the human knew something about the nature of war that the rest of them didn't. They had fought battles before, and they had seen armies crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. But this was different. In the days after the battle, the officer began to keep a close eye on the human, watching their behavior, observing their every move. The human had returned to their duties with the same calm detachment that had defined them throughout the conflict. They spoke little, offered no grand speeches, and gave no hint that they understood the magnitude of what they had done. Instead, they simply went about their work, as though it were nothing more than another day on the battlefield. The officer found themselves drawn to the human, trying to understand the enigma that they had become. How had this quiet, seemingly unremarkable soldier turned the tide of the battle? What had they seen that no one else had? The officer couldn't shake the feeling that the human's silence wasn't just a sign of strategy. It was a sign of something far more dangerous. What did the human truly know? What were they planning? As time went on, the officer's fascination with the human grew. They began to question everything they had once believed about the humans, about their place in the galaxy, about their role in this war. They had always thought of them as expendable, weak, predictable. But now, the officer wasn't so sure. The human had shown them something they couldn't explain, something that had changed the very nature of the conflict. And as the officer pondered the implications, they realized that the war they were fighting might not be the one they thought it was. The human had merely given them a glimpse of what was to come. And in that moment, the officer knew that they were no longer in control of the narrative. The silence of the human soldier was no longer a warning. It was a challenge of the officer, and perhaps the entire alien race wasn't ready to face. The days that followed the battle felt heavy, as though the very air had shifted. The alien forces had won, but it was a hollow victory. The officer couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had been building ever since the human soldier had quietly intervened. It was as if they had unlocked something in the heart of the conflict that the officer couldn't fully grasp, something that had changed the course of the war in ways no one had predicted. And now, with time for reflection, the officer realized they had made a grave mistake in underestimating the human. The quiet human had turned out to be the one force capable of shaking their faith in the superior strength of their species. While the alien forces had advanced technologically and militarily beyond the other species in the galaxy, the human soldier had fought in ways that defied their understanding. It wasn't the weapons, the tactics, or the overwhelming force they had at their disposal that had saved them. It was something else. It was a human's mind, their ability to think beyond the obvious, to adapt, and to make the right decisions in the right moments. The officer had made a critical error when they dismissed the human as another expendable soldier. But now, they were forced to confront the reality that the human silence had been the key to their success. And more troubling still, that silence was not a sign of weakness. It was the absence of fear. The human had seen what others had not. The true cause of this war, the strategy that was required to win, and the way to fight without ever showing their hand. The officer spent sleepless nights replaying the events in their mind, trying to piece together the moments that led to their unexpected victory. They thought back to the battlefield, the confusion, the overwhelming odds, the chaos of combat. They could still hear the sounds of battle in their mind, the shouts of soldiers, the roar of explosions, the whine of energy blasts as they zipped across the sky. But in the middle of it all, The human had been a still figure, moving with purpose, never hurried, always patient. The officer had watched the human's every move. When the alien forces had been on the brink of collapse, when their soldiers were pinned down and the enemy was closing in, the human had acted, but not out of desperation. No, the human's moves had been deliberate, precise. They had sabotaged enemy communication systems, had infiltrated their ranks without being noticed, and had caused enough disruption to throw the enemy into disarray. But they had done it quietly, as if they were simply another part of the scenery. And when the tide had turned, the officer could not help but wonder if that was a plan all along. The human had known what the others could not see, that the most dangerous weapon was not the one that made the loudest noise, but the one that made the quietest moves. The human had seen the bigger picture. They had understood that in war, it wasn't just about strength. It was about strategy, about patience, about controlling the flow of battle from behind the scenes. The officer's mind churned with questions. How had the human known what to do? How had they kept their composure while the rest of the alien forces had lost theirs? It was clear now that the human soldier had been the one to tip the balance, not through raw power, but through something far more subtle, far more dangerous. The officer could feel a sense of deep respect growing, but also something darker, a fear. They were afraid of what the human might be capable of if they ever truly understood their power. There was one thing the officer had come to realize. The human soldier wasn't just a warrior. They were something more. And if that was true, then the war had changed in ways no one could have foreseen. If humans could think like this, if they could understand warfare on a level that the officer and their species could not, then this war wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about defeating a force far more insidious, a force that could outwit them at every turn. The officer wasn't sure what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain. They had underestimated the human, and that mistake would not be one they could easily forget. As the war progressed, the officer understood that the humans would no longer be seen as weak or expendable. They would be feared, and with that fear came the possibility of something even more dangerous, the potential for the human soldiers to take control of the very war they were fighting. The officer's thoughts were interrupted as a human soldier appeared in their peripheral vision. They had been standing at the edge of the command center, watching the officers discuss their next move. The human wasn't participating, but they didn't need to. Their presence, quiet and calm, was enough. The officer found themselves once again drawn to the human. There was no arrogance in their manner, no demand for praise, no hint of boastfulness. They were simply there, a constant, unassuming presence. But the officer knew now that beneath the surface, the human was calculating, always planning, always watching. The officer's respect for the human had transformed into something else, a deep, unsettling understanding that this soldier was capable of much more than anyone had anticipated. And with that realization came the fear of what might happen next. The officer found themselves staring at the human. They knew that, sooner or later, the human would act again. And when they did, it would not be in a way that could be predicted or anticipated. The officer had seen the warning signs. They had felt the quiet tension building. It was as though the human was waiting for the perfect moment, a moment when they could strike and change the course of the war once more. But what if the human's silence wasn't just a tactic? What if it was a harbinger of something greater? Something far beyond this war. Something that could alter the very balance of power in the galaxy itself. The officer didn't know, but they were beginning to fear that they were on the edge of a revolution led by the quietest, most dangerous force in the galaxy. And that was the real warning sign.